Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 361. I'm tcagley, your host. The Software Process and Measurement Cast this week features our interview with Ted Harrington, author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right. Application security requires planning, coding, and testing. It's not just something that you can easily remedy after the fact. It needs to be part of the conversation before you write one line of code. Ted provides insight for developers, C-level execs, and product owners. If you have not bought a copy, use the link in the show notes, buy two, one for you, one for your boss, and then listen to the interview together. Ted's bio. Ted Harrington is the author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right, and the executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators, ISE, the company of ethical hackers famous for hacking cars, medical devices, and password managers. He's helped hundreds of companies fix tens of thousands of security vulnerabilities, including Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, and more. For his stewardship of security research that Wired magazine says wins the prize hands down, Ted has been named both Executive of the Year by the American Business Awards and an SD Metro 40 under 40 entrepreneur. He leads a team that started and organizes IoT Village, an event whose hacking contest is a 3-time DEF CON Black Badge winner, representing the discovery of more than 300 zero-day vulnerabilities and counting. Are you ready to talk application security? It's time for the interview. Ted Harrington, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
I am excited to have you. Hey, Ted, you are the author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right. Before we get into the weeds on application security, why don't we start with, tell us a little bit about the book and where people can find it.
Yeah, so I wrote this book to help technology leaders and software developers and even other security professionals address the challenges that surround application security, because I see people every day struggling with the same problems, like how do we find vulnerabilities? How do we fix them? How do we deal with change over time? How do we deal with the fact that security isn't always the top priority? How much should I spend? How do I turn this into an advantage for the business? And I see people struggle with that every day. And so I said, I know how to solve that. And so I wrote the book that specifically answers those questions that I hear people ask in some form or another every day. And so it's basically it's all stories from the front lines of ethical hacking, which I'm a leader of ethical hackers. And I tell all these, I don't name any names, don't want to shame the innocent or anything, but I tell a whole bunch of stories about how companies wind up getting popped. And those are definitely the more interesting stories. But I also tell stories too about companies that did it right. And those are less interesting because it's like, they were supposed to do this and they did this and the outcome was they didn't get hacked. And it's just not as compelling, but.
So what is an ethical hacker?
Well, let's start with answering what is a hacker, because that's a term that has been so grotesquely abused and misused in the media. And it's largely used to describe a bad person. If you read pretty much any security breach headline, it talks about hackers this, hackers that, and it's talking about the attackers. But that's only partly true. What a hacker is someone who repurposes functionality in order to make something behave differently than it was intended to do. So you might be familiar with, for example, MacGyver, that show from a long time ago, and he would take like a paper clip to somehow like fix an engine. That's hacking, right? That paperclip wasn't designed to be fixing an engine. And that's what hackers do, right? They say, how can this work differently than it was supposed to? And the fork in the road really comes down to whether or not does this hacker do good or do bad with those abilities. And so ethical hackers, which would be my side of the coin, what we do is companies come to us to help them find those issues so they can fix them, so they can make their systems more resilient, more secure. Whereas attackers do the opposite. They also look for those vulnerabilities, but they're looking to abuse them. And so that's really the sort of timeless battle between ethical hackers and the attackers that are out there.
So is it a bright line between the two, or is it a gray line?
I think it's pretty vivid, because it really does come down to ethics and motivation. And so it might be debatable how bright is the line of someone's ethical, centering. But I still think even with how squishy ethics can be and how squishy motivation can be, it's pretty clear. Are you finding a vulnerability in order to make this system better? Or are you doing it in order to achieve some sort of personal gain? And it's not even so much about gain, but it's a malicious gain, right? Are you trying to profit, make money because of someone else's misfortune? That's where it really is bad. And I mean, when did we first figure out morality, right? We were probably 1 or 2. And so as adults, even though things seem more confusing now than when we were children, we still pretty much know the difference between right and wrong.
Some of us do, at least. You're right.
Some of us do.
Some of us do. So let's ratchet it down and start to get into sort of the weeds here. You use the term application security. Application security, how do you use that word? How do you define it?
That term intentionally identifies what domain of security we're talking about, which is software. And it's drawing a distinction from, say, network security, which might be your corporate network environment, or the domains of security that have to do with humans, like defending against social engineering. So application security is all about how do you secure software? So for example, we're using multiple different types of software in order to conduct this interview. Every single one of those would be an application. Given
that software, at least in most of what the listeners would interface with, software requires a network. It requires people. It requires a lot of other different domains. Can we just secure applications, or is this a pretty messy Venn diagram?
That's a really, really great question, because the truth of the matter about security is that you have to think holistically. And where a lot of organizations really stumble is that they try to think a little bit too narrowly or too myopically and try to say, well, we did this one thing. You see it all the time. I mean, if you right now went to a bunch of websites and looked at what their security claims are, they'll all talk about what encryption they use. Oh, we use bank level encryption. It's like, okay, well, that's good. You should use a high level of encryption, but that is such a small part of the overall security scheme. And frankly, attackers don't try to break the encryption. And so this is a roundabout way of answering your question, which is that, can you focus only on application security? Well, the advice would not be to only focus on application security, but what I chose to focus on was, when you are focusing on application security, how do you do that part right? And that is the chaotic mess that most people don't know how to do, because there is a lot more information out there about network security and defending the human element, but most people are completely lost when it comes to the software element.
So once upon a time, I spent way too much time on the other end of a keyboard, banging away, writing code. How would I know whether or not the application that I was either maintaining or writing from scratch actually was secure?
There's a few ways to answer that, but the main answer is security testing. And what security testing essentially does is look for those vulnerabilities the same way that a bad guy would. We talked about ethical hacking a moment ago, and that's essentially what you want to have happen, right? You want to have someone who has that malicious mindset actually performing actions the way that a malicious attacker would. And I can give you an example. So one type of technique that everyone should really be considering is this idea of functionality abuse. And so functionality abuse is basically where you look at the way that existing functionality in a system actually works and use it in the attack itself. So for example, there is a pretty famous hacker of online games who goes by the pseudonym of Manfred. And what he would do is he would exploit the way that in-game currency works for online games. So for members of your audience who maybe aren't as familiar with online games, the concept is pretty straightforward. There is currency. You think of it like money or coins or whatever, and you accumulate or you buy that currency in order to get things that would enhance the gameplay. So maybe get a skills upgrade or weapon upgrade or access to a new level, whatever. And they have essentially these banking systems in games in order to process the transactions. And I'm oversimplifying, but it would be something like, let's say you have 500 coins or whatever they call it, but let's just say coins. You have 500 coins in your account and you need to take out 100 to get this thing. And that leaves you with 400 coins. So it essentially says 500 minus 100 equals 400. Now, the minus is the important part here because these systems were actually using positive numbers. So it was actually minus parentheses 100. And so what Manfred looked at was, well, can I actually abuse the way that game treats numbers? What if I use negative integers instead? And as you'd expect, 500 minus negative 100, as we all learned in middle school, that's addition. So he would actually increase his account balance and get whatever the upgrade or whatever it was that he was going after. And that sounds like pretty harmless, right? It's in a game, it's money to like buy a weapon or whatever. But and in a lot of ways it is harmless. But the point is, the people who built that game absolutely, unequivocally, without hedge, did not intend it to work that way. Mm-hmm. And that's what not just security testing, but testing of higher order approaches does. And that one of the real drawbacks is that a lot of people think that security testing is just run a scanner. Like if you Google right now the term penetration test, you'll get hundreds of options where it's push a button and it will spit something back. And they're pretty inexpensive and they're pretty quick. Like less than 10 grand, you can get that answer. But those things can't do that kind of stuff. There's no test for can you abuse the way integers are treated. And so that's really how you would know the answer to your question. How do you know if the system is secure or not? Well, you have to go find if it can actually be exploited.
So you can't just rely on any sort of automated security testing. You're going to have to get somebody involved that actually thinks about this stuff.
Assuming you have something that's worth protecting. So that's an important distinction to make. There definitely is software out there where it's like, who really cares? This doesn't really protect something that's that valuable. And so in that case, something that's cheap and quick and easy, sure, that totally makes sense to do just an automated approach. But I'm speaking in context of the assumption that if someone who's going to invest in something like this, they are doing so because they have something worth protecting. Maybe it's the data itself or the intangibles like their reputation or whatever. And in order to find those higher order things, functionality abuse being one, another is what's called exploit chaining, where you actually take multiple issues and pair them together. And then another is finding previously unknown issues like that have never been seen before. You can only do that manually, and it can really only come from someone who's been doing it a long time and has the right experience. There's just really no tool to do those types of things.
So that means employing people that think differently than one would normally expect in a typical corporate office. How does it actually work? How do you actually employ an ethical hacker in amongst a bunch of standard people who are trying to protect things just on a day-to-day basis? Doesn't that feel weird?
Well, in some senses, the entire craft of ethical hacking is weird, right? Like, we're good guys doing bad guy stuff and enjoying it. I mean, it's in so many ways, it's upside down. But the way that you approach it is the thing that I advise to most organizations is you probably don't want to have ethical hackers in your company anyway. Not because you don't want them, but because there's so few talented ethical hackers and you don't typically need them all the time. And you want an independent viewpoint, right? You want someone who can tell you how it is, even if it's not what you want to hear, someone who's not blinded by whatever bias or politics might exist within the organization. And so one thing that really surprises a lot of companies is that what they should actually do is they should do both. They should build in-house capabilities and they should work with outside parties to do things like ethical hacking or other advisory services. And that's how you really make it all work together, because they are different viewpoints. And that's actually a good thing. That's really healthy conflict when you've got someone who builds things and someone who breaks things, and having them sort of collaborate with each other, that good things come out of that type of conflict.
Isn't that what testing is all about in some sense of the word? There is somebody who is out there attempting to see how they could break it so that and get feedback. The whole idea of application security, having been in this world for a while, is sort of nebulous. And in many organizations, there's a whole department that's titled application security. It's their fault, right? It's all there. It's all on their shoulders. Nobody else owns it. True statement? Bad statement? You're just the craziest person in the whole world, Tom. We all own it. Who knows? Who owns it?
One of those answers was right.
Excellent. You're the craziest person. Yay!
Yeah. Well, that one, no, it wasn't that one. It was the who owns it was everyone. ... Everyone owns security, but who does the buck stop with? This really is a leadership issue. And that's something that's surprising to a lot of leaders themselves, right? It's the same. Security is the same. And we're talking about not just application security, but all security domains are the same as all of the other primary domains in a business. So for example, if you're the CEO of a company, you don't have to be the expert in everything. You certainly are an expert in some things. Like a lot of CEOs are experts in sales. That's kind of how a lot of CEOs go up through those ranks. But they might not be the expert in, say, finance or HR or the legal elements. And every single one of those, security is one of them as well, has the same premise, which is a failure in that department. It's not the department's fault. I mean, it is the department's fault, but ultimately the buck stops with the leader. And you saw evidence of that over the past, say, 5 years or so, as companies were getting breached. And who gets fired? The CIO or the CTO or the CEO, because the company and the shareholders and stakeholders are saying, this is a leadership issue. Just like if the CEO wasn't paying attention to what was happening in the finance department, the CEO would be fired, right? And so it's the same. And I don't mean to frame that as like a punishment, you're bad kind of thing, but I'm point that out just to say that's the reality of who owns it. And I can tell you a couple stories that really contrast this issue.
Yeah, that would be
wonderful. Let's look at it from the viewpoint of, I'll tell you a failure story and then I'll tell you a success story. And like I said, the failure stories are often more dramatic. So the failure story, we'll start there. So let's talk about injecting drugs into your spine. We had just completed a project. We were doing a security assessment for a company who was building this drug infusion pump, and it injected morphine into your spine. Now, as a result of this project, we had found a number of vulnerabilities that were potentially exploitable, and I found myself in this boardroom with the entire leadership team and members of the security team and the IT department for this company, along with members of our team as well, of course. And we're walking them through the different exploit sequences, and here's how someone might actually arrive at harming a patient. That's what we were really mostly interested in. We were less focused on privacy of information. We were more interested in how could someone hurt somebody. And we're in the middle of this presentation, and the CEO interrupts. He sort of slaps his hand on the table. We stop talking. He says, "It's not as severe as you suggest." And so, of course, we encourage him to elaborate, because I just told him, we just told him how you could actually hurt somebody. And he says, "Let me put it this way." And Tom, for the rest of my life, I'm never going to forget this statement. He says, "Let me put it this way." He says, "I drive a BMW. I love that car. I would never want to see it scratched. Now, theoretically, someone could haul a piano up onto the roof of our office building, throw it off onto my car, and destroy my car. But I'm just not that worried about that happening." Now, I am quite literally in the business of seeking the unexpected, and my jaw was on the floor to that response, because he was being told about how someone could actually hurt his customer. This wasn't a theoretical. This was, here's how it would actually work. And his attitude was to sort of dismiss it. And so we couldn't turn his mind around. And whatever, the project ended, and it was kind of a bummer for us to walk away on that note, but sometimes that happens. But the thing that was harrowing was then he went to go get approval for use of this device on patients. And the government agency that issues that approval asked him about the security issues with his product. And when they asked him what his plan was going to be to fix the issues that he knew about, in not quite these words, but he effectively told them he didn't intend to change them. And that was basically all they needed to hear. They said denied, and that company was no longer, they were not able to sell their product because it wasn't approved for use. And within days, maybe it wasn't days, maybe it was weeks or something, they went out of business. And I certainly don't celebrate the failure that happened in that case. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I like to celebrate success. But the story, it's a cautionary tale and needs to be told, because what happened there was this leader, this was the CEO, that top dog. He was not a technologist, and that's okay. He didn't have to be, but he had to want to get better. He didn't want to get better, so they didn't try to get better, and so they didn't get better, and it ended badly.
Not only for him, but for everyone in the organization. It'd be interesting to know whether or not he is now running another organization, but that is probably a story for a different time. Well, tell us one where it did go well, that and had a really good boring ending of no one going out of business or no one dying.
Right. Yeah. So end of story. No, there was a different company that we worked with, and woven into the story that I just told, there's a theme that carries over into this story too, which is this idea that to do security right, it's more than just testing. It's more than working with ethical hackers. It's more than having people, processes, and products. It's really an attitude, and it's a desire to get better. And in the story I just told, the desire was not there. They didn't prioritize wanting to improve. Well, in this case, we were working with a company that was a smaller company that had limited resources, financial resources, and manpower resources. But they knew that security mattered to their customers. And so what they decided to do was go above and beyond. And they wanted, when they started talking to us, they said, what's the right way to do this? What's the most thorough way we could possibly do it? And so we described to them the most thorough way they could do it. And they said, how much does that cost? And it was way more than they could afford. And so we sort of settled in on something that was still very, very thorough, but they could afford. And they were off to the races. And over months and years that would follow, issue after issue after issue after issue were discovered, and it was at times unpleasant for them. It's sometimes not really comfortable for a developer to hear, hey, this thing you did, there's a big mistake with it. You now have to go do it again. And no one likes that, but at the same time, it's like anything. If you want to get better, you kind of have to go through some tough stuff. And what wound up happening was the application, of course, kept getting stronger. The types of issues they were introducing was diminishing. And a few years later, they wound up getting acquired for more than $100 million. Now, that's a fantastic outcome for pretty much any startup would be happy with that, or most startups, I think, would be happy with that. And I'd be a fool to suggest that they were acquired because they were secure. They, of course, had everything else you needed, a great business plan.
But they were in business by that time, and the other one wasn't, so it couldn't be.
True, yeah. They weren't, we shouldn't actually gloss over that. They were in business. But what was really cool about it was that the company that acquired them, obviously a very large enterprise who's in this type of mergers and acquisitions type of business, they had other solutions that they could potentially acquire to achieve what they were wanting to achieve by acquiring this company. There were other competing options, but this company was in the game because they could prove they were secure. And by proving their security, it also revealed their ethos. It revealed that they're about improvement and being relentless and getting better. The acquiring company really liked that. And so, you already hit the nail on the head, right? Compare those two stories side by side. One story goes out of business. The other story produces millionaires. They have different outcomes, but they teach the exact same lesson, which is what you want to achieve in terms of how you think that actually impacts the outcomes.
Ted, there's a lot of focus today, last few years, on the whole idea of security, application security. There are organizations that are even going as far as to mandating it. Frameworks like the SPaMCAST, which is a framework for security in terms of assessing it. Is security something that can be just mandated?
Mandates have a place, but they are not security. And if we can extend the discussion about healthcare, I mean, everything we're talking about here is way bigger than healthcare. So I don't want to beat the healthcare horse to death, but it definitely has a great something we can apply, which is HIPAA. And so for people who don't know, HIPAA is essentially an act that is about patient privacy, but it has these enormous penalties if you don't follow it. And so people that are or companies that are in healthcare, they invest a lot of money in making sure they're compliant with HIPAA. And so that's an example of where there's the benefit to any sort of mandate or regulatory action, is that it actually has a forcing function with companies to invest in it. But the drawback is that it moves slowly. It takes a really long time to enact any sort of mandate or any sort of legislation or regulation. It usually requires tons of people to be involved, which means you have to compromise on all these different elements, which waters everything down. And then fundamentally, it needs to be universal to work for a wide range of organizations, yet every organization is unique. And so inherently, you have these gaps between what a quote unquote compliant organization might be versus a secure one. And a perfect example of that was we published some research where we were looking at medical devices, in particular patient monitors. And we found ways that you could bypass authentication on the monitor, which means you could essentially access it without any sort of like logging in, for example. And then we could perform what's called a remote code execution, which is essentially we could issue information to it from anywhere in the world, as long as we could have access to the internet, because this device was accessible via the internet. And then you could make the device do what you wanted it to do. And then, of course, there's all kinds of domino effects of if you can manipulate the device, you can now manipulate the physician's behavior, et cetera. And nothing in that whole attack sequence, which we showed a whole variety of ways that you could actually hurt or kill patients, nothing in that attack sequence touched HIPAA. There was nothing in that attack chain it wasn't that the system was in violation of HIPAA. And that's what's kind of crazy.
Wow, that's wild. That's wild. Ted, if you woke up tomorrow morning, had the power to change any two things that impacted application security, what would those two things be and why?
I'm going to give you two things that sound directly contradictory.
Oh, no.
But they sound contradictory, but I'll explain. So the first is you need to realize that it's harder than you think. And the second is you need to realize that it's easier than you think. And yes, those sound contradictory. So let me explain. So you need to realize that it's harder than you think. So we've already talked about some of these things, right? Like you can't automate a lot of the really important parts today. And a lot of people want to say like, oh, well, I saw this ad or I heard this marketer talk about how security is fast and easy and cheap. And it's just none of those things. So you can't automate it. You need to work with experts. As we talked about, you asked a really good question, which was, how do the people who build and the people who break, how do they sort of work together? And that's really what you need to do. So I think a story or a brief example that might illustrate this was there's a VC that I know, a venture capitalist, who I was asking him about security across his portfolio of companies that they have, all of which are building applications. And his answer was really jarring. He said, well, there's plenty of talent for this. Most of our people think that it's, an in-house capability, and young engineers right out of school are really, really good for something like this. And I applaud his confidence, and I really actually appreciate when people have confidence in their people and their companies. That's awesome. But in this case, I really worry for him because he has this blind spot, right? He doesn't realize that there's this enormous skills shortage with this type of talent. There's just not enough people who know how to do it. And for him to think that someone without experience in it, working at a startup with limited resources, could themselves do what an external party could do, it's completely not connected to reality. And so that's sort of the first thing is that you got to realize that it's actually going to take a little more effort than what the marketers out there might want you to believe. It's not easy, it's not cheap, and it's not quick.
Ouch, ouch. Yeah, having hired people directly out of college or people doing their final projects at places like Penn State, and hey, they can code, but there's a lot that doesn't get taught, right? It's just that stuff. It's hard, and you look at schools and you say, well, why don't they add all of this stuff in their curriculum? The answer is, does anybody want to go to school for another 2 or 3 years and then find a way to finance that? No, I think you have to get out in the real world and get some experience.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to disparage recent college graduates, because actually some of the best ethical hackers, they don't even finish high school. So it's not about age or level of education. It's more about, I think you actually answered it even better than what I said, which is that the expectation that someone who's been studying A can all of a sudden do B without having studied it. That's a nonsensical expectation. But a lot of people think that. They're like, oh yeah, building software, so you probably know where the weaknesses are. So it's kind of like, I guess if you use a real world example, it would be like the guy who builds the skyscraper, he probably knows where some of the weak points might be, but you're not going to have that guy do the demo when you need to take a skyscraper down. You're going to go to a demolition expert. Those are completely different trades, even though they sound similar.
Absolutely. Ted, this has been marvelous. How can people continue the conversation?
Well, I think the easiest would be to go to hackablebook.com. That is the website that describes my book. That a lot of the ideas we talked about today are outlined in there. That book, it is verbatim the things that I teach our customers who go from Fortune 10 enterprises to pre-funded, pre-revenue startups. And it's all the same advice in there. So join the wait list. The book comes out pretty soon. All my contact info is in there. So if you want more advice or someone wants to talk to us about maybe helping you with your security challenge, that would be the best way to get a hold of me. I'll do that.
Super. As you know, the podcast has been around for about 14 years. We've got probably another 10 in us to do. So, the podcast will be out there for a while. I open the platform at the end for you to promote anything you like. My counsel always is, this is probably not the place to sell your car on eBay. 10 years, you don't want those calls. So, platform's open. Feel free to promote anything that you'd like.
Read my book. It has all the ideas that you need. If you're right now struggling with how to secure the solution that you're building, hit me up. This is what we do all day, every day. We help companies solve their most complex security challenges. We help them effectively do two things. And the book helps you do these two things as well. But I help you secure your technology. So do the things that you need to do in order to secure it. And then we help you prove it. And that's a really important part, because that's the whole business payoff. Because as much as I want security to be a value unto itself, you really need to help the business see the advantage as well. And so when you can now hand something to your sales team and say, when our customers start talking about security, give them this. And that thing makes the customer want to buy your product even more. That's a win for you. And that's a win for us too, because we want our customers to succeed.
That is wonderful. Todd Harrington, author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right. Thank you for spending time this afternoon on the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you so much for having me.
In Reread Saturday, you'll notice there was no Reread Saturday yesterday. This week we are taking a break from Great Big Agile and OS for Agile Leaders by Jeff Dalton. We're going to dive into Chapter 4 next week. In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, we're going to reprise another one of the panels that we did on March 18th, 2020, just as things were getting interesting. We're going to discuss what we've learned working and supporting remote teams. The panel was comprised of Jeff Dalton, Amy.McDonough, Sandeep Koorse, Christopherhurney, and myself. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?